So we are talking about judging today, and I just want to ask some questions. How many of you guys have felt judged in the last year? Raise your hand. Okay. Last month? Last week? Last day? Okay, this one kind of freaks me out, but I'm going to ask it anyways. The last 10 minutes of being in this room. Oh no! I hope that's not the case, but judgment is all around us. We all feel judged at some point or another. I know for me, for this sermon for today, guys, I'm going to be giving it from a perspective as a woman as we celebrate International Women's Day. So I'm going to give some examples specifically to my perspective of being a woman in our world today. And so just some ways I felt judged as a woman is one through my marriage. So Nick and I got married at 18 and 19 years old. And so you can imagine when someone gets married that young, there are a lot of judging eyes online and around you and wondering what the heck you're doing. I have the same questions to my 18-year-old self, but that's beside the point. No regrets, but I was pretty young. I feel judged sometimes of how I interact with Nick, my husband. Sometimes I feel like I'm too critical of him in front of other people or in front of some of you, and I'm like, oh no, what are they going to think of our marriage that I was too critical to Nick or whatever. I grew up at a pretty conservative Baptist church, and so something that was a big topic in that church was submission, and so that's a whole nother sermon. We're not going to get into that today, but I felt judged for not submitting enough over and over and over again. Another category was the area of kids. So since we got married so young, we didn't start trying for kids for a few years into our marriage. But after that, I started getting the comments of, once you have kids, you'll understand, or, those types of things. And I felt judged for not having children. And then we went through a time of infertility. And so about 6 years of that time was really hard when people would say those types of comments, because I was like, I'm trying here, I'm trying. I didn't say that, but I wanted to. And then we did IVF, which thankfully I got pregnant through. But during that is a very controversial topic today. Even in the past few weeks, I was on Facebook and I saw somebody post something negative about IVF, and I felt judged once again. Even being up here on this stage right now, I feel judged just for being a woman and being a pastor. That whole category, sometimes I feel like when we go to ministry events and I'm the only woman in the room or one of the few, I feel judged by the men in the room. I don't know what they think of me as a woman and a pastor. So judgment can be all around us. Sometimes it feels like last year that Barbie movie came out, and at the end she gives that speech of like, you just can't win sometimes, it feels like, as a woman. But on the other hand, there are so many opportunities to judge, right? Judging is kind of fun. I love reality TV, if I'm honest with you. I'm up to date on Love is Blind. I like Survivor, The Bachelor sometimes I'll get into. All those different reality shows, I'm into it. But why am I into it? Because I love judging people. When I'm watching it, I'm like, oh, there's the heroes, there's the villains. Oh, I know exactly why they did that. Oh, that person's terrible. Oh, that person's good. And it goes on and on and on. Hopefully, I'm not the only person in this room that likes reality TV, but you can judge me, it's fine. So the other way we judge is we feel like it's our duty. If we're out and about and we see someone treating someone poorly, if we're at a restaurant, we see someone being a jerk to the waitress, we think it's our duty to judge that person for being so mean, right? Or, again, as a woman, if I'm walking down the street, sometimes it's in my best interest to judge who's behind me. If I see a guy walking behind me, I'm going to judge him. I'm going to be like, is this guy safe or not? Do I need to quicken up the pace? Do I need to call somebody? I'm making judgment calls all the time. In preparation for this message, I have seen judgment everywhere. Nick kind of mentioned it. I've been pointing it out to him, and I've been seeing it everywhere in other people, in conversations, but also in myself a lot. It's everywhere. But the question isn't, how are we supposed to not judge, but how do we judge correctly? Because sometimes, like I said, judgment is a good thing. Thank you, James. Today's message comes from Matthew 7. We're going to be continuing the Sermon on the Mount. We lost a kid. On the Sermon on the Mount, which we've been in for the past couple of months, and we're going from the interior spiritual life to the exterior spiritual life. So we're going from prayer, fasting, giving, materialism, anxiety, which Charity talked about last week, and this week we're transitioning to the exterior, and that's starting with judging others. And so today, the big idea that I want to get across to you is that if you're going to judge someone, first choose yourself. And now when you hear that, you might think, wait, my therapist or my self-help book told me, no, this is not right, but I want you to stay with me, hear Jesus' words, let's look at the Bible, and then we'll go from there, okay? Does that sound good? Because when I first saw this, I was like, I don't know about that, but I think it's catchy enough that it'll stay in your brain, so we're going to stick with it. So first, we're going to look at Matthew 7, starting with verse 1. Do not judge others, and you will not be judged, for you will be treated as you treat others. The standard you use in judging is the standard with which you will be judged. This verse is basically saying you will be dealt with the same way that you deal with others. Whatever tolerance you show to others will be the same amount shown to you. How many of you guys have heard this verse before? Just the first part even. Judge not. This is probably one of the most overquoted verses in the Bible, and people love saying it all the time, but I would argue that most of the time it could be a bit misquoted sometimes if we don't look at the whole context. But I think it's important here to notice that Jesus doesn't completely prohibit judging. He says how we are to judge is how we will judge is how we will be judged. This was referring to the rabbis at the time. They had two different ways of judging. It was justice and it was mercy, that they had these two different categories of judging. And so Jesus was even saying that either you will, if you choose justice and you judge others with justice, then you will be judged with justice. But if you judge with mercy, you will be judged with mercy. And so it's basically you pick. It's up to you. The other thing we need to keep in mind in this too is that this word judge comes from the Greek word krino, which means to discern or decide, but it can also refer to condemnation. And so when we're looking at this passage, a lot of commentators will tend to agree that this should be do not condemn others and you will not be condemned. And so it's so important to keep that in mind when we're looking at this passage. What does condemn mean? When I was looking into it, it's basically looking at the motives of others. And I don't know about you, but I can hardly understand my own motives. That's why I go to therapy a lot. Trying to figure out that is really hard. But trying to figure out your motives or anybody else's motives in the world is impossible, right? We can't figure out other people's motives. And so if we're looking at this verse and we do it all the time. You think of that annoying coworker. He's clearly perfected the art of incompetence. I'm surprised they haven't fired him from every job he's ever had. Honestly, it's painful to watch. Do you see how we do that? We just say that annoying coworker, he's not just bad at his job, he's bad at every job he's ever had, right? We just jump to the big conclusion there. Or we look at these poor kids, they're running around like crazy. It's obvious their mother has absolutely no control. I can just imagine the chaos that must be at their house. You're just making assumptions all the time. Or that husband, he's married to his job, not his family. He doesn't care about his kids. He cares about spreadsheets way more because he was just looking at his phone during a meal. We make all these assumptions all the time about people, and we condemn them constantly in our mind. I hope I'm not alone on this, guys. I was noticing it in myself all month, so I hope you do too. And if not, don't judge me, don't condemn me. And so our first point was consider yourself before you condemn. But how do you judge fairly? How do you figure that out? How do you get to that point? We have to get to the next verse, which is, and why worry about a speck in your friend's eye when you have a lot in your own? A log in your own. How can you think of saying to your friend, let me help you get rid of that speck in your eye when you can't see past the log in your own eye? Hypocrite! First, get rid of the log in your own eye, and then you will see well enough to deal with the speck in your friend's eye. Have you guys heard this parable before? Some of us in this room, yeah? Okay, so we're a little bit less familiar with this passage. But yeah, this is a parable that Jesus throws in here. and to help illustrate his point. And basically he's saying, if you see that your friend is in need of help with something in their life, first consider your own issues before giving them advice. The log in this passage is basically telling us how much more tolerable we are of our own sin than we are of other people's sin. Right? We are so much more tolerable. We see this type of nonsense in John chapter 8 when this woman is caught in adultery. This is what happens. Just imagine someone coming in here, the religious leaders of the town, coming in, throwing a woman on the ground and saying, she was just caught in adultery, Jesus, what do you do? Can you imagine the shame that woman would experience in that moment? And not only that, they were picking up stones to stone her because in that time, that's what they would do if you were caught in adultery. So it's not just shame, it's also that she was about to die. And they say, what are you going to do with this, Jesus? What are you going to do with this woman? And he starts writing on the ground with his finger. And he says, he who is without sin among you, let him throw a stone at her first. And then Jesus stood up again and said to the woman, where are your accusers? Didn't any of them condemn you? No, Lord, she said. And Jesus said, neither do I. Go and sin no more. That story is so cool to me because it's another moment that Jesus is prioritizing women. In that time, women were seen as property. And so just him standing up for that woman and pointing out the logs in all of those Pharisees and religious leaders' eyes right then and there in the dirt. But they don't even mention what those sins are in the scripture, right? We're just supposed to guess or supposed to just try to figure it out. But it's just so crazy that Jesus steps in and says, neither do I. Go and sin no more. She's set free. Some examples of how we are so much more tolerable of our own sin is you're late to work, right? Because you had a crazy morning. It's daylight savings. Everything's happening, your kids are tired, all this stuff. But he's late to work because he's lazy, and he never gets to work on time. And what's wrong with him? You're driving fast because you have an emergency. You have to get to work right now or you will get fired. But she's driving fast because she doesn't care about anyone on the road other than herself. You're not eating healthy because you had a long day. You need that ice cream. You need those chips. You need those Cheez-Its. You need that comfort food, okay? But he's not eating healthy because he doesn't care if he lives long enough to see his kids grow up. Like, these are the extremes that we do in our mind, right? We just make these judgments all the time, and we condemn people all the time. But when it's to ourselves, we're like, oh, we're good. We have a reason for why we do the things we do. So what does it look like to take the log out of your eye? I think of a few different situations. It could be like who to promote at work. If you're in a position that you can promote someone, are you holding them to a higher standard than you do yourself? Are you measuring up to that standard that you're putting on them? Or maybe it's like who to marry. That's like a huge thing, but you're looking at his finances, you're like, he doesn't have a 401k. But like, are your finances in order? Are your finances perfect? It's thinking through those things. Or even which church to go to. When you walk in and you're like, oh, they're so cliquish. But are you always the most kind to strangers? It's asking yourself those questions. It's not saying those things are right. It's just saying, what's going on in your heart first? What's your log that you need to get out of your eye first? Because if you don't get the log out of your own eye, you won't be able to see clearly. But before we help that friend that's having that problem with the speck in their eye, we need to discern before you disclose. This next verse is, don't waste what is holy on people who are unholy. Don't throw your pearls to pigs. Another version of this also talks about dogs. Dogs and pigs are mentioned in here. They will trample the pearls and then turn and attack you. Another way to say this is, don't try to teach holiness to people who don't want it. This is so interesting because Jesus just said, don't judge. And then at the end of the passage, he's saying, hey, those are pearls, those pigs and dogs out there. He's talking about people. That's a judgment call, right? So it's very interesting how Jesus teaches. This is to make us think. This isn't this isn't a contradiction. This is his amazing teaching happening here. And so this week I decided, you know what? I'm curious what a dog would do with some pearls. And so those of you who know me, you would know that I gave Albert some pearls. And he was unenthused. He did not care about the pearls. I tried to get him to position correctly, but he did not see the value in the pearls at all. He just wanted the treat that I had in my hand. And so luckily they fit right around his neck. It actually worked out really well. But I did take them off quickly after because I didn't want him to scratch and get pearls everywhere. But that's what it is in this verse. That's what it's talking about. These pigs and dogs, they don't know what to do with the pearls. They have no idea. They're not people. They don't know the value of the pearls. And so when it comes to wisdom, for those of us who have been in the church for a while or maybe just living for a while, we have some wisdom maybe that we want to pass on to people. But so often, if we throw it to pigs and dogs, it's not going to go well. They're going to turn and attack you. 1 Corinthians 8:1 says, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. As we become more knowledgeable of the Bible, we have more knowledge, and quickly that can turn to condemnation. We can think that we know better. We can step in really quickly and start wasting what is holy on people that we shouldn't quite do that with. I can think of a scenario of like someone's anxious. They come to you, they're talking to you about being anxious, and you are automatically like, do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, submit your requests to God. In that moment, that's wisdom. That's right from the Bible. That's good. But is that what they can handle in that moment? Or is it too much for them? They just need a listening ear. We have to discern before we disclose. So often we can have this circle of condemnation. A friend is venting to you about something, and venting to you about this coworker or whatever. And then what happens is then you start to say, hey, you shouldn't judge. And then you step in and you start judging them for judging others. And then they start judging you for judging them. And it just goes around and around and around and around and around. And so how do we stop that? We have to start with ourselves. We have to get the log out of our own eye first, right? We can only control ourselves. And so in closing today, I wanted to just share one more story when it comes to judgment. I had another story, and I decided to nix it this morning. I just felt like with it being International Women's Day, I wanted to share this instead. And so a few years ago, I had this moment that I felt like I was told to stand up for myself in an abusive situation. And so I basically called out my abuser pretty publicly. And in that season, I had a lot of dogs and pigs, if I can be honest with you. I had a lot of people not believing me. I had some people believing me, but I had a lot of people questioning my character and questioning me. And so in that, I had to realize these are dogs and pigs, even though it doesn't sound really nice, but Jesus used it right, so I'm going to use it too. These people don't understand the wisdom that I'm trying to portray to them, and so I had to distance myself from those people because they were causing me so much pain. And now looking back, I can say, okay, yes, that was a scenario that the main point, if you're going to judge someone first, choose yourself. That one, I'm like, well, in that season, honestly, I judged myself a lot. And I didn't judge him nearly as much as I should have. And instead, that was that season of God needing me to look elsewhere and be like, this is what I'm calling you to, is to stand up and to say this isn't right. But then in this season right now, I'm not in that, right? I'm in the season of noticing, there's some judgment in my life. There's some judgments in my mind that I need to reflect on a lot more. And call out the log in my own eye a lot more often. So all that to say, this passage is tricky. This passage is hard to live out sometimes in certain seasons, and sometimes we have to offer ourselves more grace, and sometimes we have to give ourselves a little bit harder of a time and realize, hey, our judgments are hurting people. And so I encourage you this week to meditate on this scripture, to look for the judgment in your own heart, to call yourself out more often, and to really meditate on this and ask God. We're going to close in worship here, and ask God to show you where you're at. Which season are you in? Are you in the season of, hey, I'm actually judging myself a little too much, or am I judging myself a I'm not being as tolerable as I should be. So right now we're going to welcome the worship team up here, and then we're going to start and do some baptisms as we worship. So as they're coming up, I'll close us in prayer. God, thank you so much for today. Thank you for just allowing us to celebrate International Women's Day. And we just pray that you would be with us. You would show us that log in our own eyes, God. Show us that log that we need to remove. Help us to judge ourselves first before we judge others. And we just pray that you would be with us for the rest of this service, God. In your name.